This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the BSI Press. Manuscripts, collections of papers by international writers, and books covering a wide range of other Sherlockian topics. Find them online at BakerStreetIrregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the thumb was engineered, the foot was deviled, and the Peter was black, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder what a basket chair is? Or why Watson's medicine of choice is always brandy? Or what a coal scuttle is and why cigars would be there?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 235, Two Maids A-Missing. Well, hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast, where we look at the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, you're still here, right? You haven't gone a-missing.
No, but I have for a while, but I'll be along in about 5 or 10 minutes. So,
oh, perfect. That gives me time to do a little housekeeping here where I tell people they can find the show notes for this episode at ihose.co/trifles235. And that will take you to SherlockHolmesPodcast.com, where you can poke around. You can look through our show archives. You can figure out how you'd like to support the show. We would appreciate either comments coming in from you, a rating or a review on Apple Podcasts, or if you would care to help the show financially, we have a Patreon. And you can get to it by clicking on that orange Become a Patron button for as little as $1 a month. It helps us keep the lights on. Not only figuratively around the show here, but also in the shrinking attic space that Bert and I both share with the brain that we clearly put on the shelf for every episode. So we appreciate your support and your attention. So let's get on with the show. Well, Two Maids A-Missing. It reminds me of, and I don't think it's any mistake, of the classic holiday song, the 12 Days of Christmas. What was it? They were maids a-milking in that song, if I recall correctly. But how many of them were there? How many maids were a-milking?
Yes, I think that is exactly right, Scott, because when you're milking, you need to do two things. First of all, you can't go down to the barn unless you're carrying 2 buckets, because one would just be too heavy. That's why you've got the shoulder brace. But also, you need to be carrying 2 buckets because on the one hand, you need to be getting regular milk. And on the other, 2%.
2%. Well, the good news is we are talking about even numbers here. It is 8 maids a-milking. And Bert, I do realize the great irony of asking you about a Christmas song. That would be like you asking me about a Hanukkah song. Not really fair.
I love Christmas carols.
This is probably the worst Christmas carol anyone has to endure, though. The repetitive nature. By the time you get to verse 12, you are just ready to sock someone in the eye.
Oh, no, it's a lot of fun. I'm a big fan.
Wow.
And there are so many great recordings. I mean, if you like Bing Crosby, Bing's Bing's version of this is a standard at our house.
Oh, I've never listened to Bing's version of 12 Days of Christmas.
Well, I've got a couple of minutes now. Do you want me to put it on?
No, I'm good. I'm good. I will say I am familiar with Alan Sherman's The 12 Gifts of Christmas.
Oh, yes.
You know that one?
The Sony transistor radio.
Yeah, a Japanese transistor radio. What was it by the time he got to 8?
Well, there was a calendar from his insurance man.
On the 8th day of Christmas, my true love gave to me an indoor plastic bird bath. And all that other stuff and a Japanese transistor radio.
Yeah, but the sad part was the plug on the earphone didn't work.
That's true. It was bent. Well, we're not here to talk about the 12 days of Christmas, the 12 gifts of Christmas. We are here to talk about Two Maids A-Missing. Our inspiration for this episode actually comes from a gentleman who is partially the inspiration for our very podcast. Bill Hyder, William Hyder, is a member of the Baker Street Irregulars, and for years he has included a half sheet of paper about something that he has picked up in the Sherlock Holmes stories, and he says it's just a trifle, but there's nothing so important as trifles. And a number of his trifles that he has included in the BSI dinner packet every year during the BSI weekend have become topics here on the show. Well, Bill actually has an article in the winter 2020 Baker Street Journal called, wait for it, Two Maids A-Missing. Two Maids A-Missing. And we thought that it would be fodder for a discussion here. So, Bert, how would you like to pick up on this? Where shall we begin with Two Maids A-Missing?
Well, I think we need to begin with the position of the maid in British society. And the fact is that many of the cases of Sherlock Holmes involve people of great means, people who are of a higher strata of society. And it's very interesting because this is a constant theme throughout the cases of Sherlock Holmes, not necessarily class or people of distinction, but the fact is that almost from the very beginning, from time, and actually it is from the very beginning, time and time again, you're brought into contact with households, and particularly in Sign of Four, for example, where, Mary Morstan is, I don't know that Mary Morstan is not a maid, but she is pretty much alone in the world, and she is living with an aunt. And so there are people, and we'll encounter people like this again and again, people like Violet Hunter as an example, who are all alone in the world, who sometimes come to Sherlock Holmes with problems and challenges, but who also can cause problems and challenges. And that's really what's going on in a Blue Carbuncle. Because Holmes, as soon as he sees, Peterson, the commissioner, brings in this Blue Carbuncle. As soon as Holmes sees the note, he remembers the newspaper accounts. And, of course, the facts are that the Countess of Morcar at the Cosmopolitan Hotel has had this in her dressing room. And before the case is out, Holmes concludes quite rightly that the real thief here was the maid Catherine Cusick, who had conspired with the hotel's upper attendant, James Ryder, who's the real villain here. Certainly shares guilt equally with Catherine Cusack to frame this innocent plumber. And there, is just one example of an aspect of the Blue Carbuncle that we don't really think a lot about. But how was it exactly that Catherine Cusack came to have this relationship with the hotel's upper attendant, James Ryder, such that they would share confidences, such that they would plan and execute this kind of crime?
Well, I think it as we begin to parse apart the crime here, it was pretty clearly Catherine Cusack's idea. She hatched the plot as a goose would hatch an egg, and she simply needed she needed a confederate. She needed someone effectively on the outside, right? So she arrived at the hotel with her lady, with the Countess of Morcar, as they would travel together, and very quickly kind of identified who else would be in the hotel, who might be, let's say, malleable to her feminine ways and wiles in some cases, and who might be looking for a way out. I think James Ryder fit the bill. And the question I've always had is, let's say Henry Baker didn't lose his hat. Let's say that the crime was pulled off in a way such that it was exactly as they had envisioned. Okay. what do you think Catherine Cusack would have done with James Ryder after she got her hot little hands on the gem? Do you think she would have kept him around? Do you think she would have brought him with her on the lam to wherever it was she was escaping? Or did she have other plans in place and, maybe had a confederate on the other side that she was working with that had recruited her?
Oh, that's a great point. Actually, that makes a lot more sense because, the idea of stealing such a singular, valuable, and obvious stone, what exactly do you do with it? I mean, it's not like a diamond where you could cut it up and make smaller stones out of a particularly large diamond, although that's not without its risk. So you would need to sell it to someone who would be a collector of gems and who would enjoy it privately, because you certainly couldn't exhibit it. So there is the question of, did they think it through at all? But you're raising a great point here, because although the way the crime is executed, as soon as she gets the gem, and she's the one who's got it in her possession at the start, she's got to do something with it to get rid of it, because she's going to be searched. And her room would be searched, and she can't really afford to hide it in the hotel. So she gives it to Ryder. So now it's out of her possession, and now she really is in Ryder's hand now, because he's the one, unfortunately, who's got the stone.
Right.
But you have to wonder, to what degree they really had thought it through. But it's a lovely aspect of the cases of Sherlock Holmes, because it's one of these things where you just touch this little question. Catherine Cusack, what was on her mind? What were the relationships? How long had the Countess been staying at the hotel? When did Cusack first meet James Ryder? What would have been the future if it had been succeeded? There's like this whole other universe there that just comes from asking another question.
It does.
And there's a more important question about Catherine Cusack, which is, what happened to her?
Well, I think I saw her in some of her mid-'80s movies. Oh, no, that was Joan Cusack. Sorry.
That was Joan Cusack, and she's still going. She's still going. Because, at the end, you get the great denouement where Ryder goes free. But what exactly happens to Catherine Cusack?
That is true.
No idea.
She disappears into the ether of London. I'm sure... with her connections, she probably found someone else just as scheming as she, and managed to get engaged in another position somewhere.
Well, we don't know that she lost her job.
Well, do you think that the Countess of Morcar would have been completely duped by that? Do you think she would have been trusting in that regard, or do you think she would have had suspicions?
Well, at the end, to get the reward, I mean, we presume that the Blue Carbuncle left the hands of Sherlock Holmes, was returned to Catherine Cusack either via Scotland Yard or by Holmes directly, and that the reward was paid, and perhaps, even Henry Baker might have benefited a little bit. But for all of that to happen, the owner of the gem would say, so who took it?
Right.
And
right.
There's only one answer to that, and that is, sadly, Countess, you're a trusted maidservant.
Right. So Catherine Cusack clearly had to be, just like Joan, a working girl. We will be back right after this quick break to talk about the other maid that's missing. Stay tuned. Just after we finished the last episode on secret societies, it hit us. We should have been talking about the BSI manuscript series entry Mandate for Murder, which was a look at the manuscript of the Red Circle. Well, we went to the shelf and pulled that book off for this ad, and we thought, wow, let's follow it up. Well, hey, here's the thing. That book, written in 2006, 15 years ago now, is sadly out of print. The good news is the Baker Street Irregulars manuscript series lives on, and the latest issue, or the latest entry in that series, is the Staunton Tragedy, a facsimile of the original manuscript of The Adventure of the Missing Three-Quarter, with annotations and commentary, and it's edited by Wiggins Emeritus himself, Michael F. Whalen. It's a high-quality reproduction of the handwritten manuscript and an annotated transcription, just like all of the BSI manuscript series. There are a number of fascinating essays around this overlooked story, including where the House of Grief was, getting the dates right. What are the other 6 ruses that Holmes talked about? By authors like Phil Burgum, Bill Dorn, Mike McSwiggan, Lou Lewis, Don Isben, John Linsenmeyer, Peter Blau, and more. You don't want to miss an opportunity to pick up this latest entry in the BSI manuscript series, The Staunton Tragedy. Get over to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and pick up your copy today. Okay, we are back talking about 2 Maids A-Missing. We covered Catherine Cusack and how she kind of disappeared at the end of the Blue Carbuncle. Bert, who was the other maid that Bill Hyder focused on in this article?
Well, it's 11 years later, and it's the case of the Six Napoleons. And this is a very different case because this involves professional, as Bill points out, professional criminals and a ruthless murder, and the police are busy investigating it. But Bill also points out, this is a lot like the Blue Carbuncle because the owner of a priceless gem has had a gem stolen, and the theft occurs in a London hotel, and the thief, as it turns out, is the woman's maid. And in this case, this is the princess's maid, Lucrezia Venucci.
Lucrezia Venucci. Now, the Black Pearl of the Borgias is the jewel we're talking about this time. And it went missing from the Prince and Princess of Colonna's bedroom. And the police were called in. Holmes even consulted on the case as kind of an aside there, but he wasn't able to do anything about it that time. And you would think that given his experience 11 years earlier with a jewel gone missing from a hotel of someone from the higher class, that he would have been ready for it, and yet he wasn't.
Yeah, it is odd. I mean, with that prior experience, and the obvious culprit would have been the maid, but without any evidence, I suppose it's difficult. And yet, the evildoer here, who was her brother Pietro, how difficult really would it have been to trace and to find out and to investigate and to get a link, just by asking about Lucrezia Venucci's relatives. So that is a bit mysterious.
It is. And I think my recollection of the telling of this story by Granada makes a reasonable supposition that Lucrezia and Beppo at one point were romantically linked. And he came into possession of the pearl. That means, well, she may have been the conduit by which this occurred. Of course, her brother was, could have had her best interests in mind. Maybe her brother was looking to steal the pearl back from Beppo. We don't know. But a scuffle ensued, and Pietro lay dead on the doorsteps of Horace Harker. And that eventually led Holmes to conclude, as the Napoleons were being busted around London, the busts were busted, that there was a likelihood that the pearl might be found in one of the remaining casts.
Yeah, but it is very strange, that my memory is in the story, though, isn't Beppo is being pursued, obviously, and he's not being pursued because it's suspected that he's stolen the pearl. He's being pursued for some other reason that we never discover.
Right.
So that's, pretty unusual. And then, of course, what happens in the events of the story is Beppo is arrested for whatever that lesser crime is, and then he eventually gets out of jail. And then these events
goes on the hunt, right?
Yeah, come back.
And here, to Bill's point, we don't hear anything more about Lucrezia Venucci after this. Watson doesn't mention her. Lestrade, a policeman, shows no desire to put her behind bars. And I think this probably is because of the workmanlike job that Holmes did. You know, that very theatrical revelation of, gentlemen, you know, let me introduce you to the Black Pearl of the Borgias. Watson, Lestrade at the end were just so in awe of Holmes's ability to uncover this long-lost jewel that, well, in this case, the maid, again, did go a-missing.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, the fascinating thing there, of course, as you point out, Lucretia Venucci passes away into the pages and into the history of literature without any clear sense that she suffered for her crime. But among the many lovely interactions here and intersections here is the intersection between the Granada presentation of this particular case and Star Trek. Because, of course, Lucretia Venucci in the Granada presentation was played by the talented and gifted Marina Sirtis, who played Deanna Troi on Star Trek The Next Generation. Although, as I remember, she had 0 lines on the screen. I don't think she uttered a word.
In the Six Napoleons?
Yeah.
She had a couple. They were just screaming and sobbing, and it was a very emotionally driven performance. But to your point, nothing memorable there in terms of speaking lines. They were the speaking lines that were missing. Yeah. Well, before we close this out, I did mention at the top of the show that there were 8 maids a-milking. Do you remember how many geese were a-laying in that story, that song?
6 geese
a-laying, just like 6 Napoleons, one of which laid the Black Pearl of the Borgias.
Oh, we've got to ask Karen Wilson to help us on a version of this that covers, 5 orange pips.
Sure.
That we can sing
the
sign
of 4, 3 students.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, Karen, you have your marching orders. For the rest of us, it's just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Catherine Cusack put me up to it.
Her ladyship's maid?
Exactly.